Thank you so much for being here. Thank you, Professor Dr. Brian Kemple, for being here. Thank you also, Dr. Remo Gramigna. Thank you so much. We will start the session. Let me see if we are on now. And then we start. And thank you also for the audience present here. Thank you so much. Okay, so let's start. Hello and welcome to the 2022 International Open Seminar on Semiotics, a tribute to John Deely on the 50th anniversary of his passing. I would like to welcome you if you are watching us live now or watching the recording on YouTube. This collaborative international open scientific initiative and celebration connects a network of dozens of personalities and organizations coming from various environments and with different profiles, all working in unison towards the advancements and propagation of semiotic studies. Today is our second presentation representing the historical module of the seminar, a presentation called Augustine Instituting the Given Sign by Dr. Brian Kemple. Thank you, Brian Kemple, Professor Brian Kemple, for accepting our invitation. And we are also delighted to receive here Dr. Remo Gramigna. Thank you again for being here. I also have to mention that after the presentation and the commentary, all people participating here on Zoom are welcome to share commentaries, insights, and questions regarding the Kemple's presentation. And that's the reason we call this an open seminar. We want to spread seeds of wisdom, and you who are watching this presentation are welcome to share insights later today. I would like to start introducing Professor Brian Kemple. Professor Brian Kemple holds a PhD in philosophy from the University of St. Thomas in Houston, Texas, where he wrote his dissertation under the inimitable John Deely. He is the founder and executive director of the Lyceum Institute. Philosophical interests and areas of study include Thomas Aquinas, John Poinsot, Charles Peirce, Martin Heidegger, the history and importance of semiotics, scholasticism, phenomenology, as well as ancillary interests in the liberal arts, technology, and education as a moral habit. He has published 2 scholarly books, Ens Primum Cognitum, in Thomas Aquinas and the Tradition, and the intersections of semiotics and phenomenology, Peirce and Heidegger in Dialogue, as well as a number of scholarly articles, popular articles, and his own Introduction to Philosophical Principles, Logic, Physics, and the Human Person, and the forthcoming, and the book that was recently published, Linguistic Signification, a classical course in grammar and composition. In addition to being the executive director of the Lyceum Institute, he is the executive editor of Reality, a journal for philosophical discourse. Thank you, Brian Kemple, and you can start our presentation.
All right, well, thank you very much, William, for that great introduction. And thank you to Professor Gramigna. I was reading through his work last night on Augustine, and I'm delighted to have such a distinguished and insightful scholar here to provide commentary on my presentation. I think I'll have many great insights to bring to bear and can point out and correct any mistakes that I happen to have made in my presentation. Now I'm going to try and share my screen here, and I'm less familiar, sadly, with Zoom than I am with Microsoft Teams. So hopefully this will all work out all right, and our presentation will go along well enough. Okay, so to preface with a few comments here, as this is the first of our presentations in the historical module, which I'm delighted to be able to give, which has been subtitled From Early Latinity to the Last Postmodernity. And I think that it's one of the hallmarks of Deely's interpretation of history that never is it ever merely historical, that the whole trajectory of the historical investigation brings us to a deeper insight of today. And so I believe that this subtitle of Early Latinity to Last Postmodernity is very apt, as we today begin from the very inception of the proto-semiotic, as Deely called it, to think about the semiotics that we deal with today. And as we start with the very beginning of the Latin age of philosophy in its great first figure of Augustine of Hippo, and I wanted to bring some thoughts of how that bears on our work today, on our situation today. In the background of this is also, of course, the figure so seminal to John's own work of John Ponceau, who will pop up here and there in the lecture, and I expect in our discussion as well. So to begin, there are few figures more influential in the history of philosophy than St. Augustine of Hippo. A prodigious intellect, productive of an enormous breadth of thought, author of works spanning roughly 50 years, and a figure of no small importance in bringing the sign into an explicit philosophical perspective. So it seems only fitting in this, the second of our seminar's presentations, to note this influence of Augustine through a quote from our great inspiration, John Deely. In his 2009 work, Augustine and Ponceau, the Proto-Semiotic Development, Deely writes on the seminal character of Augustine's work for semiotics, saying that his proposal of sign as a general notion divided into naturalia, or physiognomic, and data, or teleonomic, was pregnant with the full scope of semiosis, or action of signs, as we find it debated in the 21st century. And it is quite amazing, and a tribute to his well-known genius, that it proves not difficult to find in Augustine's original proposal of the contrast between signa naturalia and signa data, the embryo of the full-blown discussion today of an action of signs in the universe at large, physiosemiosis, as well as in the living world as a whole, biosemiosis. Well, I would strongly encourage everyone interested in the history of semiotics, and particularly in this concept of it as from early Latinity to last postmodernity, to seek out and read the whole of that work on Augustine and Ponceau. Sadly, a little bit more difficult than it ought to be to find a copy these days, but to seek it out and read it very closely. For Deely there illuminates Augustine's most crucial contribution to the history of semiotics, and thereby sets out a background for the bright shining light of Ponceau's semiotics, semiotics which transcends the boundaries of world and mind as well as of nature and culture, I think thereby destroying two of the false artificial divides that characterize modern philosophy, and which I would say plague us unto this day. Now, of that Augustinian backgrounding, or we might even say foreshadowing, Deely places his focus on the most salient passages of Augustine's De Doctrina Christiana, in which Augustine both proposes a novel definition of the sign and establishes the aforementioned distinction between signa naturalia and signa data. And I should note with Professor Gramigna here that a very similar definition of sign is also given in the De Dialectica. But in this lecture, I do not intend to repave this road which Deely already so well laid, though no discussion of Augustine's contribution to semiotics can avoid following that path of inquiry for at least a little while. Ultimately, my intention here is to examine the metaphysical reason for which I believe that Augustine's proto-semiotic falls short, not in the De Doctrina Christiana text, but rather as unfolding in his theory of the human person, and by extension, the interaction of the human person with the universe as a whole. This critique is not meant to fault Augustine. As that saying so popularly attributed to Sir Isaac Newton goes, if we see but a little further, it is only for standing on the shoulders of giants. And here we perch not only upon Augustine's, but also Deely's and Ponceau's and Aquinas' shoulders and many others besides. From those shoulders, we may see the Augustinian proto-semiotic from within that full scope of semiosis as it is viewed in the 21st century. And so it is within that context, the question that is of the action of signs within the universe as a whole, within the living world, and most especially in the species, specifically human life or cultural world. It is within that context that there are three main points to this lecture. The first concerns the definition of signs, which is given in the De Doctrina Christiana, with a brief exposition of what that definition means. The second concerns the following distinction into naturalia and data, with an extended analysis of how Augustine understands the purpose of given signs. And the third and final point concerns the developments and difficulties arising in Augustine's consideration of signification and learning, principally as illustrated in his De Magistra. Now, in the end, we will see the relevance of these shortcomings in our own day and age beyond their historical importance. So when it is said, and often it is, that Augustine proposed the first definition of the sign as indifference to being natural or instituted, this is not a claim that no thinker before him ever treated of given or instituted signs. One can certainly very easily see Aristotle doing so in the Perihermenias, or Anaximenes of Lampsacus in his Rhetoric to Alexander. They're both treating of words, and they're treating of them as significative in some way or another. But Augustine does seem to be the first so-called mainstream and still influential figure of philosophical history to have proposed such a definition in a formal and explicit manner. Now, his definition of the sign is to be found in Book 2, paragraph 1 of the De Doctrina Christiana, which text is concerned less with signs as such and more with their institution in the sacramental and doctrinal life of the Church. However, in this passage, he writes, and this is on your screen, Signum est enum res praeter specium quam ingerit sensibus ariod aliquid exe faciens in cogitationem venire. As is usually the case, Augustine's Latin demands some flexibility whenever we translate it into English. So in my own rendering, as you also have on the screen before you, a sign is anything which, beyond the specification which it brings into the senses, makes something other than itself come into cognitive awareness. And I think there are three elements that we can consider in this definition. First, that the sign is anything, to which point I will return in a moment. Second, anything that brings a specification into the senses. And third, that beyond that specification, it brings something else into cognitive awareness. So to return briefly to that first element, that the sign is anything, I have followed Deely's translation in rendering the Latin word res as the English word anything. For Augustine's definition, as expressed in the distinction between naturalia and data, comprises the whole range of possible sense objects. However, notably, this definition is limited by its second element, that the action of signs consists in an impression made upon the senses. In other words, the effect of the sign, as Augustine is here conceiving it, consists in something beyond what is impressed by sense. But the action of the thing which is acting as a sign is itself limited to a sense impression. The sensible world we inhabit may be perfused with signs that arouse certain objects or things in our cognition, but Augustine is here positing, subtly but undeniably, a divide between sensation and cognition proper. And this divide is very important for understanding, I believe, what is at fault in Augustine's approach to a proto-semiotic. But thus, as Augustine goes on to give some examples of signs, by the seen trace, we cognitively grasp the animal of which it is a trace, and we grasp the fire under the seen smoke, and we turn our minds to the affection of a living thing whose voice is heard. and by the horn or trumpet sounding soldiers know they must advance or retreat, or whatever else the fight demands. Well, of course, these are all true examples of signification, some natural, some given, but all the signs that Augustine has given here as examples are merely instrumental with regards to cognition, which I think is actually reflected grammatically in Augustine's repeated use here of the ablative case in his Latin declining of the nouns in question. So this constraint to the instrumental is of no small importance, no small consequence, though it is a constraint unavoidable given two elements of his definition. First, the identification of the sign with a thing, a res, and second, identifying the action of signs with their impression upon sensation. Now, to see the consequences of this limitation to the instrumental, let us proceed into our second main point. Concerning signs, Augustine continues in the De Doctrina Christiana, some are natural and others are given. Of the natural, to which he pays little attention here, he says that they are, quote, those which, without any will or other appetite to signify beyond themselves, make something other to be cognitively grasped, as smoke signifies fire. By contrast, the given, or what we might call instituted signs, are those, quote, which living things give to one another for the sake of demonstrating, insofar as they are able, the motions of their souls, whether concerning things sensible or intelligible. Well, let's take a moment here to think carefully through this description of the given sign, of the signa data. The purpose of its being given, the only purpose, Augustine says, is to demonstrate the motions of our own souls, to make outward and therefore receptible by another person something which is internal to ourselves, to bring to another's mind what is in our own by bringing what is in our minds somehow to bear upon a thing in the corporeal world. The intention to communicate here seems to rely upon a kind of mutual transcendentality between the one communicating and the one being communicated to. The thing, which is given as a sign, in other words, if it succeeds in its purpose, serves to signify something which it does not contain in itself, as it is in itself. There is, as Augustine portrays it, a stark divide between the signifier and the significate in given signs. The volitional element of the signa data means that such a sign, even if closely aligned with one which is natural, such as a grimace when pained, entails a transcendence of the physical, requiring a spiritual accomplishment in order that communication be effected. The purposefully affected grimace, after all, may be proximately intended to communicate a pain, but it could also be the case that if there is no pain, or if the grimace is exaggerated relative to the pain actually felt, one's intent in communicating is not to let others know that oneself is in pain, at least not ultimately, but is something further, to receive sympathy or pity, or to deceive the recipients, the ones being communicated to, somehow about one's own state. Now, regardless, Augustine turns his attention to those most prevalent and most human of signs, words, for, as he writes, words have obtained an absolute preeminence among human beings for signifying anything conceived by the mind that someone wishes to reveal. That it is to words that we wish to turn our attention as well, for words really are the most prevalent of given signs. And so now we turn our attention away from the De Doctrina Christiana and move to considering Augustine's De Magistro. This text, written around 388 or 389 AD, most likely, takes the form of a short dialogue between Augustine and a presumably at least somewhat fictionalized version of his son, Deodatus. The historicality of the dialogue is, as Professor Gramigna has pointed out, a contentious and thorny issue. Now, broadly, the dialogue may be divided into 3 parts. The first, covering the initial 7 chapters, concerns the relations of linguistic signs, words, to one another, and our distinct awareness of the role of linguistic signs in our experience. As Deely has pointed out in his own commentary on this text, this is to show that linguistic signs, or signs in general, are really quite ubiquitous in our experience, that we're constantly engaged with signs in our day-to-day lives. And then concluding this first section is the recognition that signs are broader than the linguistic alone, which I think leads to the second part in which Augustine and Deodatus debate the relation between signs and the objects they signify, both those objects that are in the mind of the communicator and those objects independent of any finite mind, hinting, albeit obliquely, at the triadicity which is involved in signification. I won't really have too much to say about that, but it is worth noting that the triadic nature of sign relations seems at the very least to be implicit in this section of the De Magistro text. But this second part ultimately concludes with a denial that our learning is accomplished through signs themselves, such that signs are relegated in the third part of the text to an incidental and instrumental role in the mind's grasp of any true knowledge, which Augustine proposes can only be accomplished by divine illumination. Now, concerning this first part of the De Magistro, there are a few key passages which can help us to understand Augustine's contextualization of the given sign and its role in our cognitive lives. The first passage concerns the distinction between self and other representation. For those of you not familiar with Ponceau's or Deely's discussions of these matters, very succinctly compressing many things here, self-representation is that which an object possesses, while other representation is the distinctive characteristic of a sign. When I see the door to my office strictly as seen for itself, it's representing itself to me. When I see the door as a means of privacy, however, the door comes to signify something other than itself. For learning the significance of any such sign, we often seem to rely upon other signs. That is, if I wanted to communicate to someone else that the purpose of closing the door is to give me privacy, and my interlocutor wanted to know what privacy is, I would likely rely upon the use of other linguistic signs to convey this meaning. I could assist this demonstration by some other actions. I could tell my questioner to go wait in the hall while I close the door, giving examples otherwise of private communication or whispering. I could point out encoded languages or secret messages, or I could discuss the idea of things you don't want other people to know. But even that shows that by and large, my attempts at communication would rely upon the use of linguistically given signs. And there's a similar conversation which unfolds in this part of the text between Augustine and Deodatus concerning the meaning of the verb to walk, ambulare. While we can show someone the act of walking in response to the question, what is walking? There are many ways in which the other person might be confused. They might think we mean moving in general, or going away, or ignoring someone, leaving someone hanging. Right? If all we do to try and answer the question is starts to walk, there's many ways in which that could be misinterpreted. And so to explain walking as such, we seemingly need to add a specifically linguistic context of intelligibility. Thus, this discussion needs Deodatus to say, I confess it is not possible for us to demonstrate something without a sign, if we are asked about what it is that we are doing. For if we add nothing, our questioner will think that we do not wish to show him and are neglecting him to persist in what we were doing. In other words, if you just start walking when someone's asking you what you're doing, they're not going to gain any real context that makes intelligible your response, your attempted response. But I think it's worth noting that Adeodatus here, and therefore as a mouthpiece for Augustine, does not say that it is impossible to learn without a sign, but rather that it is impossible for us to demonstrate without a sign. This indicates both that learning may take place in a context of sign mediation, but not that learning itself is sign mediated. And it indicates that the giving of signs serves explicitly to effect an externalizing of our internally possessed meaning or understanding. The sign is given, that is, in an attempt at providing a context in which another may grasp the meaning, but that alone does not instantiate or result in a successful communication of meaning, at least not necessarily. Okay, so the second passage of De Magistro's first part, which I like to look at here, concerns our awareness of linguistic signs as such, and specifically that this awareness is one which occurs mentally. The passage, which is essentially the entirety of chapter 5, begins by questioning the signification of signs by other signs. For instance, we signify the words or, and, because, and so on by the use of the other word conjunction. But where the word and, when used normally, signifies the additive connection of thoughts, the word conjunction signifies the general idea which is accomplished by any such use of a word, whether additive or contrastive or anything else which might belong to a conjunction. What Augustine intends by this example, and the many that follow it, is that we convey one thing by calling a linguistic sign a word, a verbum, and another by calling it a name, a nomen. And yet every such sign can be called both. A word, a verbum, from the fact that it strikes the ear, a written word being taken here, as in most of antiquity, as a sign of the spoken, and a name, a nomen, from the fact that something happens also to the mind. Thus, we are aware not only of a sense-perceptual signification, but also of a meaning that is intended to be communicated when we grasp that signification. This meaning has an independence from the sound, which, as Augustine says, can be recognized by the fact that different words in different languages name the same thing. Recognizing this fact, we must acknowledge a difference between the means of signification, the word, and the object signified, the something which is meant, the aliquid, which is to say, the intelligibility which is being named and for which the word, which is incidentally also a name, serves as an instrument. And so the third and final key passage from the first part of the De Magistro comes from Adeodatus's recapitulation, wherein is summarized the whole of the discussion to that point, where the relations between signum, verbum, and nomen are made explicit and made succinctly. Here, Adeodatus states, indeed, this disyllabic, which we sound out when we say signum, sign, signifies everything by which anything may be signified. However, when we say verbum, it is not a sign of every sign, but only of those which are offered through vocal articulation. Thus it is clear that while the two syllables of signum signify verbum, and are in turn signified by the two syllables of verbum, signum nevertheless extends to more than does verbum. By contrast, there is an equivalence in the generality of verbum and nomen. For all the parts of speech were shown by reason to be names, because pronouns are able to be adjoined to them, and of all of them it can be said that they name something, and none of them cannot be adjoined by a verb to form a sentence. But although verbum and nomen extend equally far, such that all things which are words are also names, nevertheless their applications are not identical. There is a reason why we call one verba and the other nomina, which appears sufficient to resolve the distinction. For of the former, there is a striking, a verberationem, a striking of the ear, and of the other, an inscribing in the memory of the mind, which may be understood from this, that we rightly say, when we wish to commit something to memory, what is the name for that thing? But we do not customarily say, what is the word for that thing? No. Indeed, if we are learning a new language, we might say, what is the word for that? But not if what we're trying to do is to understand what a thing is itself, or to retain that thing in memory, to come to know that thing. We don't ask what the word for it is, we ask what the name of that thing is. So I might mean the same thing whether I say Prost or cheers, which meaning exists in some sense whether any verbal articulations are put to it or not. And so while there's an equal extension of verbal articulations and nominal identifications, Augustine holds through Deodatus that this is only because both the name and the word are instruments for a reality that cannot be comprised by either. So I think what we gain from these three passages taken together is that Augustine perceives the given sign as conventional and as incidental to knowing. We seek names for that which happens in the mind, names which are incidentally words, for they pertain to meanings grasped which are not other, but are self-representations. It is this self-representing meaning which we grasp that alone qualifies as knowledge. And as we will see, this knowledge is not objective in the sense that Deely uses that term, nor is it mediated, but it is internal and immediate or unmediated. So to return to an earlier point, and one which is taken up in the second part of the De Magistro text, it remains to be seen if signs can be of use in learning. As we already saw, it was argued that they are necessary for oneself to make some demonstration. But this is not the same as someone else coming to know. This is not the same as learning. So I think what we find here in the second part is a tension which is unsatisfactorily resolved, perhaps not even to Augustine's mind. For throughout the first and second parts of De Magistro, this dialogue, as mentioned, is revealing the ubiquity of signs in our experience. No interaction occurs between human beings without signs. And the specifically human way of dealing with meaning is always mediated from one human being to another by the giving of signs, by the institution of signs, and by the use of instituted signs. Thus, roughly halfway through the second part of this De Magistro text, we find a statement which really seems, I think, unequivocally true, that nothing is taught without signs. Or to take a more full statement of this, that nothing can be demonstrated by simply performing the action, except speaking, which consists in giving signs. But even speaking is itself a sign. So it seems there is absolutely nothing that can be taught without signs. Further, as an aside to this, in the first book of De Doctrina Christiana, Augustine writes that every teaching is either of things or signs, but things are learned through signs. Yet, despite this, Augustine in the De Magistro affects an absolute about-face, and within just a few paragraphs claims that nothing is discovered through words, and that through those signs which are called words, we learn nothing. Well, the simplest explanation, I think, and I think the one which is true, for this rapid turn resides in Augustine's conception of the person, that the real human being, the fundamental, essential human being, is not that which exists together with and through the body, but rather is that which is the inner man, the soul which inhabits the body, purposefully, fittingly, but nevertheless still somehow incidentally to its own proper mode of existence. Even the action, which ought to seem most unifying between soul and body, is, in Augustine's works, seen as occurring somehow mysteriously across a divide, namely that act of sensation or sense perception. As Augustine writes in De Musica, it seems to me that the soul, when it feels in the body, is not affected in anything from the body, but acts more attentively itself in its affections. And then these actions are either easy on account of the agreeableness or difficult on account of the disagreeableness, and they do not escape the soul. This is all that is called sensation. In other words, the objects of sensation do not move the soul directly, but serve as matter on the basis of which the soul may move itself in varying degrees, inasmuch as the material interactions of sensation in the bodily are found agreeable or disagreeable to the soul's proper activity. This divide between what is proper to the soul and what is proper to the body resonates throughout the De Magistro in the divide between the sound of the word and the intelligibility signified by the name. Always the sense perceptual is mitigated to an instrumental role, even before Augustine's claim that nothing is taught without signs. And so, as we see him say, returning to the De Magistro, to teach or advise of something, or to be taught or advised, which thing either you exhibit or is exhibited to you through a fitting name, is not having this thing, this knowledge, more precious than merely having the name itself. In other words, the knowledge of the thing is superior to the sound which goes along with the name of the knowledge. And so, as Augustine here goes on, now if these things are true, as you know them to be, you see immediately how much less value we are to attribute to words than to the things for the sake of which we use the words, since the very use of a word is valued above the word, and words exist for the sake of being used and are used for the sake of teaching. Just as it is better to teach than to talk, so talking is better than words. Therefore, learning is much more valuable than words. Well, on the one hand, there's something here that I would call almost obviously true in what Augustine is saying. Knowledge is better than any means or instruments of knowledge, as is any end, which is at least judged to be better than the means to that end. But on the other hand, the manner in which Augustine is dividing up knowledge as the end from its instruments, the means, not only suggests but explicitly relies upon a division in being, a division between that wherein knowledge exists and that wherein the instruments of it can occur, a dualism of the material and the spiritual. Thus, a certain pivot occurs when Augustine says, if someone were sufficiently intelligent, he could discern the whole art of bird catching simply from what he sees of it. It is enough proof for the issue before us that certain, not all, but certain persons are able to learn without signs. In other words, to recur to that earlier example, Augustine's here saying that someone could learn what you mean by walking without any other signs to explain it, but simply seeing what walking is itself. Now, given the context, we might incorrectly assume that what Augustine here is talking about is that it's possible to learn without given the signs, that someone might learn the art of bird catching by means of natural signs alone. But recall the previous point concerning sensation. Sensation happens not by the thing impressing itself upon the soul, but upon the body to which the soul turns its attention. Thus, not even natural signs need to be involved in someone's coming to know. And so Augustine then makes in the De Magistro a full turn away from that earlier claim that nothing is taught without signs to the claim that nothing is learned with signs. He writes, "If we consider this more diligently, perhaps nothing will be found which is learned through its signs. When a sign is given to me, if I do not know that of which it is a sign, I am able to learn nothing. But if I know it, what do I learn through the sign? Before I had discovered that a word was a name of a thing, the word was to me only a sound. I discovered it was a sign only when I had learned the thing of which it was a sign, which, as said, was learned not from signification, but from looking at the thing itself. And therefore the sign is learned from the thing, rather than the thing from the sign for which it is given." Now it does bear noting, again, that there is a distinction, which is not discussed in any way explicitly by Augustine, but that there is a distinction between teaching and learning as acts of a human being. It is one thing, that is to say, that nothing is taught or demonstrated without the use of signs, and another to say that nothing is learned through signs. Certainly, just because I teach something does not mean that you learn the same thing. Teaching is effected through signs, but learning, according to Augustine in the De Magistro, is not. For the soul learns by turning its attention to the things themselves, to the discovery of which things we may be aided, assisted by signs, but which signs do not contain or themselves convey the meanings as such. For this reason, Augustine inverts the expected order. It is not from signs that we learn things, but from things that we recognize signs of them. The mind's grasp of a thing is somehow essentially independent of any signs, and the only role that signs may play in our grasp of something is helping the mind attend to that thing. Thus, Augustine ultimately severs the physical being of a sign at the reality of the signification. As we read, in any sign, there are two things simultaneously, the sound and the signification. We perceive the sound, certainly not through the sign, but when it strikes the ear. And the signification of the thing, which is signified, we perceive through looking at the thing itself. Thus, through these signs, which we call words, we learn nothing, but rather, as I have said, we learn the force of the word, that is, the signification which lies in the sound, when the thing signified by the word is known, in which we perceive the signification of the word as such. The perceptual world, in other words, lies entirely under the auspices of the spiritual. There is a superior reality to the spiritual, for which the perceptual can only serve as an instrument, for the sake of which the being of the perceptual exists at all. What then affects the understanding to this grasp of the reality, of the real? How does the dark mind of the creature come to possess lights of intelligibility? As we see in the ultimate conclusion, which Deodatus reports as having learned from the conversation, it is by a divine light alone that we are able to understand. I have learned by the admonition of your words that words do not but alert a person in order that he might learn. What an interesting, seemingly paradoxical statement there, right? And there to be but very little of the speaker's thinking revealed through his speech, and that I am to be taught the truth of things spoken alone by him who dwells within and advises me about the things outwardly said. That is, the meaning or the truth of a thing is spoken alone by him who dwells within. Not a speaking from without, not through the external mediation of a sign, but through the internal and immediate illumination of the mind by Christ alone. One hears, listening closely enough, an echo of the Platonic ideas, only now they are not located in a separate realm of intelligibility, but in the divine, but in God. The ideas which are the really real things, of which all else is but a participation. I think in some sense, we could consider this a question of the chicken or the egg. That is, did Augustine's conception of the sign lead to his dualistic anthropology, or did his dualistic anthropology lead to his restriction of the sign? Chronologically, we find both the De Magistro and the De Musica to precede the De Doctrina Christiana, but interestingly enough, the De Dialectica seems an even earlier work. Given an unshaken commitment, however, to this illuminationist theory of knowledge, Augustine could not but confine the scope of the sign to mere extrinsic instrumentality. As Deely writes, this illumination from within the mind alone enables us to see things as they are, signs and other objects alike, signa et res, so that only the truth which speaks within the soul, which Augustine identifies with Christ, the only teacher, not the use of signs as such, is able to instruct the human soul. Nor was this wheeling about in the De Magistro a mere display of rhetorical and dialectical mastery of the subject matter. It revealed one of the most permanent and profound ambivalences in Augustine's thought. For the very man who introduced to the world signum as a general notion, the very man who Todorov and Manetti tells us proposed a general semiological system based on communication, was the very man who, in the study of the whole of his writings, stands unmistakable as a man for whom communication was always an inscrutable mystery, a mystery to which acceptance of Christianity alone could provide insight and answer. Well, I think the Christian might find something admirable in Augustine's absolute faith in Christ the teacher. But it is problematic nonetheless to rely upon supernatural interventions, themselves inexplicable for explaining anything belonging to a creature in possession of its own nature. To leave communication an inscrutable mystery is to mire ourselves in an at least subjectivistic or at worst solipsistic prison, from which the only escape is some faith. So it thus strikes me as odd, but perhaps also timely, that we are now holding this seminar, that this very same error seems common in our present and as yet still ultra-modern culture. The error that is of dualism, severing the sense-perceptual world of signs from the inner dwelling source of truth, meaning, and knowledge. I don't think anyone today, or at least the vast majority of people today, would deny that our corporeal world is permeated by signs and significations. But those signs are not recognized widely as integral to the truth grasped by any mind. For Augustine, the inner truth is itself the consequence strictly of divine illumination. Truth, meaning, the intelligible, knowledge, whatever terms we would like to use, these supersede what he recognized in the sign-mediated communication of the corporeal world. But arguably, the incontrovertibility of one's own lived experience is, for the present-day ultramodernist, itself akin to a kind of divine light. The signs are out there, and they may lead us to discovering our truth, but they do not contain or convey or stand essential to the truth, at least so it is thought. And it is for precisely this reason that, as I intimated at the outset of this lecture, that the proto-semiotics having its genesis in Augustine's definition of the sign, and recognition that the essence of the sign stands in difference to being natural or given. It is for this reason, this error that one finds in the contemporary ultramodernist, that we require a better metaphysics to be paired with our semiotics in order that our semiotics flourish as it ought. And so, by contrast, to look at a figure in possession of such a superior metaphysics, we might look at that most prominent of proto-semioticians, standing at the opposite end of the Latin age of philosophy, namely John Ponceau, whom we might in fact name as really the first true semiotician, although that's a point that we'll attend to at greater length in a later presentation for the International Open Seminar on Semiotics. But for now, I just want to take a quick note of an article from Ponceau's disputed question on terms in his Prima Pars Artis Logicae, where he asks whether vocal expressions primarily signify concepts or things. And there, he gives as his conclusion, vocal expressions signify things and concepts by one single signification. The foundation for the statement is that vocal expressions signify both thing and concept by the same imposition, and therefore also by the same signification. And second, because vocal expressions signify things and concepts not equally immediately, and one separately from the other, but the one by means of the other and as subordinated to the other. Therefore, the same signification suffices for both. Or to put this in other words, where the vocal expression for Augustine has significance only if the mind already possesses the meaning of the thing in question, such that it may then consequently direct itself to the thing signified, or result in the mind being directed to the thing signified. Ponceau is here saying that it is of the nature of the giving of a vocal expression that a double signification be carried with it through that singular act of imposition. And so in support of this conclusion, Ponceau explains, notice, however, that the concept itself can be signified in two ways. First, as it is in itself a sort of thing explicitly signified and knowable reflexively by means of another concept. And when the concept is referred to in this way, it is signified by a special name stipulated for the purpose, such as the name concept, for it is signified in the same way as other things are. In a second way, concepts are signified as a kind of interior sign or means of conceiving things, from which interior signs are derived those exterior signs, words and writings or gestures, by which the interior signs are manifested. And in this way, concepts are signified by outward expressions as exercising this function of making things known. Now, we find here in this passage a discussion which is echoing Augustine's distinction between verbum and nomen. That is, the first way in which a concept can be signified, according to Ponceau, accords with Augustine's notion of the nomen, that which signifies the meaning as intellectually grasped. The second way, however, in which the concept is signified aligns with the function of the verbum, in which the concept is not an in itself object situated in a separate realm of intelligibility, but is rather itself a formal sign. And so equipped with such a notion that the meaning, the intelligibility, the knowledge of the truth concerning some thing is not in participation in the ontological being of the divine idea, but rather is the formal signification of the thing itself as it actually exists. Equipped with such a notion, Ponceau's semiotic perspective avoids the error which leaves the Augustinian in a perpetual mysterious fog. Now, it is well known that Augustine had no love for Aristotle and was unimpressed reading the categories. Perhaps had he had access to, or maybe enthusiasm for more of Aristotle's work, he would have recognized the lack in his Neoplatonic anthropology, and what I believe is ultimately an incoherence which is thereby produced through his doctrine of signs. Thus it is that I'm concluding this lecture with an eye forward to my next, looking ahead to that coherent metaphysical system produced in the thought of Thomas Aquinas some 800 years after Augustine, which I think opened the door to a better understanding of signs as we find it in John Ponceau. So I've proposed a few questions here, just sort of generally on this last slide, but I look forward with a lot of pleasure to Professor Gramigna's commentary. So thank you for listening, and I look forward to this discussion.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Brian, very much. Hello, everyone. This is 2022. Hello, team. Are we connected here?
Yes, Elma, we are connected.
Okay, great. Hello, everyone again. This is 2022 International Open Seminar on Semiotics, a tribute to John Deely on 5th anniversary of his passing. Thank you, Dr. Brian, very much. Unfortunately, I couldn't catch the beginning. I have to, revert on that earlier, but thank you so much for your comprehensive and insightful presentation on the contribution of the very particular, special, unique contributions of Augustine on the instituting the given sign. So today we have an intervener as well on Dr. Brian's presentation. He is the proper intervener in a way, as he has doctoral thesis on the philosophical problem of the sign in St. Augustine in tandem with the issue of lying. Here today we are grateful to having Dr. Remo Gramigna. Dr. Remo, I would like to have a very brief introduction on your background for the sake of audience. So allow me, please. Dr. Remo Gramigna is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Turin, currently, a Department of Philosophy and Education Sciences. He teaches semiotics in this department. He is part of the research team Facets led by Professor Massimo Leone. Professor Massimo Leone is also one of the names in contemporary semiotics. Dr. Remo's academic research to date has mainly focused on the history of semiotics, the semiotics of culture, and also mainly on the deception studies. Dr. Remo has obtained a PhD in semiotics and culture studies in Estonia, of course, in the University of Tartu, and he has also lectured there in the Department of Semiotics. As I mentioned, Dr. Remo is the right intervener for this presentation, given that he has studied in depth the case of St. Augustine contribution on sign institution. He has got many publications on this topic. Some of his recent publications include Augustine and the Study of Signs, Signification and Lying, Forms of the Mask, Imagining Others, Deception, Predictions, and the Disguised Intentions in Strategic Interactions. For this particular seminar, International Open Seminar on John Deely, Dr. Remo is a member of the Scientific Council. So I'd like to really welcome Dr. Remo to take the floor with his presentation. Dr. Remo, the floor is yours.
Good evening, and thank you very much for reaching out, first of all, and thanks a lot for inviting me today. Let me say that it's a pleasure and an honor to be here. The more so on commenting on such a compelling subject and on such an outstanding presentation. So thanks a lot for organizing this for us. I'm not very familiar with the structure of your seminars, so I thought to contribute with a few comments and a few questions for you in order to facilitate the dialogue between yourself, myself, and the audience as well at home. So one of the keywords in your brilliant presentation is the history of semiotics. And you have very well laid out the place of Augustine in such an history. This is praiseworthy in and of itself, and I believe it should not be taken for granted. As you have pointed out, there have been some scholars that have very well underscored the role of Augustine and his Scientia Signorum in the proto-semiotic development, and Professor John Deely is a case in point. John Deely played a remarkable role in tracing this history within the field of semiotics, and I am very glad, let me tell you, to see that his legacy is continuing and flourishing today. If I may add some names to the lists of scholars that have worked diligently and systematically towards the development of contemporary semiotics, standing on the shoulders of giants, as you said in your talk, we may also include Tsvetan Todorov and his book, Theories of the Symbol. We could also add to this list Umberto Eco, who in his article entitled Proposals for the History of Semiotics regarded Augustine's theory of science as an explicit semiotic theory. And also Giovanni Manetti, Professor Giovanni Manetti, that you mentioned in a quote from the book of John Deely. Giovanni Manetti wrote this text, which is called The Theory of Science in Classical Antiquity. Also, outside the domain of semiotics, it is certainly worth mentioning the pioneering works on this subject carried out by the philosopher Belford Darrell Jackson, as well as by the British historian Robert Marcus, who were, in my opinion, the first studies ex professo that were devoted to Augustine theory of science. Now, all these scholars were catalyzers, as it were, towards opening up this fascinating as well as complex subject. So I really thank you, Professor Kemple, for bringing forth this topic today. A few words about the novelty of Augustine's thought and Augustine's theory of science. You have very well stressed the influence of Augustine in the history of philosophy and in the history of semiotics, and you have laid out the linchpins of his theory of science. Perhaps it would be important to stress that Augustine's novelty was perhaps not so much the division between natural science and given science, but to have included words, verba, in the genus of science per se. In the Latin world, this was unheard of, and thus the inclusion of verba in the species of signa, I believe, is pivotal. If we limit our horizons to the Latin authors, he was probably the first to acknowledge this point. The second remark is that Augustine used his theory of science not so much for its own sake, but as an application to the interpretation of the scriptures. Thus, I really liked the point you raised about the instrumental nature of science, namely the issue of science as being instrumental to cognition, which is a very remarkable point. Perhaps I would only add to this point that the application of a theory of science to the interpretation of the scripture is also an important aspect to keep in mind with respect to the instrumental nature of science. Now, a few words about the concepts that you have pointed out of teaching and learning. Since one of the mottos of your presentation has been learning, so the issue of whether we as humans learn at all by means of science. So let me tell you that I did learn a lot from your presentation, and I thank you for that. I particularly enjoyed the bridge you have made between probably the most well-known work of Augustine within semiotics, the Doctrina Christiana, and perhaps some of his less known works, such as on the teacher, the Magistro. Although the dialectica was left out in the presentation, the inclusion, on the other hand, of the Magistro and the Musica adds up a lot of valuable insights to this discussion. I particularly appreciated that you have singled out a conceptual and theoretical distinction between teaching and learning, which is not so evident in Augustine's work, or at least it is not as clear as one wanted it to be, which, as you have so brilliantly showed, brings up some paradoxical or problematic conclusions, to say the least. In a way, it seems to me that you go beyond Augustine, not only showing some pitfalls and some shortcuts in his writings, namely the somewhat arbitrary division between the outer world of science and the inward world of truth and knowledge. But you also reach out for solutions, finding a way out from this quandary and indicating in the system later laid out by Poinsot a possible solution. And this is really something that I appreciate. Yet whether we do need a better metaphysics, or whether the problem of learning is resolved altogether through the recourse to Poinsot semiotics remains still an open question. As far as I understand, we will have perhaps a sequel to this presentation, bringing up Aquinas and Poinsot on the table. So I look forward to listen to the future seminars as well. As for the difference between the concepts of teaching and learning that you so well pointed out, it is worth noting that in the opening of the Magistro, there is a question which is posed by Augustine, which introduces ex abrupto a reference to the nature of speech. Indeed, Augustine asks, what does it seem to you we wish to accomplish when we speak? And Adeodatus replies, either to teach or to learn, as two different functions of speech. However, things, as you have pointed out, get quite murky when teaching and learning are somewhat linked to the successful uses of science. And I have appreciated a lot that you made a sharp distinction between these two concepts, inasmuch as it clarifies a point that remained somewhat hidden in Augustine's own writing. Having said that, I would like to dwell, if you allow me, on some terminological issues. I do believe that semioticians and historians that deal with the history of philosophy and semiotics should strive somewhat towards a precise and technical metalanguage for a host of different reasons. Charles Morris insisted a lot about the need for semiotics to use not only words that are fit for describing the phenomena that we intend to study, but also words that have a high degree of technical precision and that would avoid a certain degree of vagueness. I would say that the distinction between signa naturalia and signa data that resurfaces in your presentation is a case in point. It is definitely a hallmark in the Augustinian semiotics, as you have remarked. As you know, the history of these two terms is also a history of a misnomer, somewhat. This is so because the terms signa naturalia and signa data were somewhat rendered into the English translations, as well as in other languages, Italian, for instance, French as well, as natural science versus conventional science. Whilst the translation of signa naturalia as natural science is accurate, Perhaps the translations of signa data as conventional signs is less accurate and potentially misleading. This issue was raised in 1962 by a short paper written by Engels, who pointed out that using the terminology conventional signs as opposed to natural signs would obliterate the rationale of the original distinction and did not do justice to the author's original ethos. Thus, Engels proposed to use given signs or even intentionally given signs in order to stress that this kind of signs is not predicated upon, in order to stress that this signs is predicated upon whether there is a will and intention from the standpoint of the sign giver to produce the sign and for the sign to occur as well, or whether such intention is lacking. So the title of your presentation, Augustine Instituting the Given Sign, not only references to the primacy of the given signs, but it also makes a reference that these signs are somewhat instituted. Likewise, throughout the paper, you use the terms signa data, given signs, as well as instituted signs interchangeably, thus distinguishing natural signs versus instituted signs. So my question would be the following. I would appreciate if you could clarify for us why the term instituted signs could be perhaps preferable, so a preferable terminology, and whether the original volitional criteria is somewhat preserved is if we stick to this somewhat different terminology as compared to the, let's say, original one, or if we compare it to the rendition that was given by Engels. Would you like me to continue with the questions, or shall we proceed like a dialogue?
Well, I'll leave that up to Elma as to whether she'd rather see a dialogue or
Well, I guess a dialogue would be great for both, because to me, this is a very unique kind of distinction between the natural science and conventional science, and it's new to many of us. So I suppose, Dr. Brian, we really are eager to hear your view.
Yeah, so regarding in particular this use of the term instituted, I'm actually using that in the sense, as I mentioned, I'm giving 3 presentations for this open seminar. This first on Augustine, a second on Aquinas, and a third on Ponceau, as well as another commentary on Ponceau. And so the use or the draw of the term institution actually comes from our great organizers of this conference at the University of Coimbra and their heritage in the Conobracenses, who in their discussion, their treatise on signs, refer to, instead of given signs, they refer to signs ex instituto, in contrast to naturalia. And it's, I think it does well capture that intention, that volition, which is perhaps more specific than the more general notion of given. Given, particularly in our culture, maybe not so much in the time of Augustine, but in our culture it has a broader significance. So I use the terminology of given as synonymous in some ways with instituted to maybe help situate our thinking about that, and maybe the Conobracenses as a kind of central unifying point, and also a point of departure that Ponceau will pick up himself, and that he doesn't use the terminology of instituted because he looks for a further distinction within signs that are so given or instituted, such that Ponceau will use the terminologies of stipulated and customary. Stipulated or ad placitum, to being placed is the Latin that he uses, right. And ex consuetudine, customary from custom. So the use of the term instituting or instituted signs here is to try and draw a little bit of that historical thread from early Latinity to the end of Latinity. So I don't know if that helps.
Yes.
To
yes, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
This brings me to the following up question, still about terminology. You have rightly pointed out that Professor Deely used instead a different type of terminology to refer to the same division. That is to say, he used physiognomic and teleonomic to refer to signa naturalia and signa data. So I was wondering if you could also elaborate a little further onto this point. I found it very interesting that Deely used this specific terminology, especially the reference to the physiognomic layer of natural science. So the somewhat reference to the expression of the faces that are somewhat given unintentionally in order to encapsulate the meaning that is assigned to a general class of natural science.
Yeah, and so yeah, you've actually touched here on perhaps one of the issues where John and I had the most frequent and lengthiest disagreements, which is specifically over regards his preference for the term teleonomic in contrast to teleological. And now this is again one of those points where we encounter the historicity of a certain linguistic sign that requires us to, think about, as you so rightly pointed, this sort of necessity of a terminological precision and clarity, as Morris insisted upon drawing, I believe, upon Peirce and his ethics of terminology, his insistence that we have clear and good and precise terms. And so the substitution of nomos for logos in these words. I've perhaps come a little bit closer to John's way of seeing things after a remove a few years and thinking about it more carefully. But I can recall arguments sitting in his office for probably a couple of hours at a time about whether or not we can redeem the word logos and redeem the word logos to include this signification of thirdness. So I'm definitely expanding beyond the historical here, I think, into more doctrinal issues of semiotics as it's present today. But after all, that's part of what the historical is for. That there's something that we have this difficulty, I suppose we could say, between the logos as pertaining perhaps more to a cognition-independent structural reality, and the nomos to our articulation of structural realities, cognition-dependent and cognition-independent alike. And so this is why I think I've moved a little bit more sympathetic to John's position, that the physiognomic, I think maybe there we could still say physiological, right? But the physiognomic as the structures which belong to things according to their natures as they dispose them. And then the teleonomic, the structures of things insofar as they're ordered towards ends which may or may not be strictly confined to their natures. That is, human beings, we have ends which are not determinate, let's say, entirely by our natures. That we have an active participation in orienting ourselves to our ends, even as much as those might be grounded in and inseparable from our natures. There's an indeterminacy in our participation in attaining them. And so I think that's why, the institution of signs, right, whether they're stipulated or customary or transition from stipulation to custom, that's part of the role that they play, right? Is this self-directedness, self-determination towards the ends which are fitting and appropriate and proper to us, a determination which is not given to us by the physical as such. The physical does not give us all the tools that we need for establishment of those kinds of signs. And so, I think that's what he was getting at anyway. In
Thank
the Augustine
you.
and Buzzo book.
It's very fascinating. I think that the papers by Marcus and by Darrell Jackson, which I mentioned in the introduction of my comments, certainly refer to this debate about the terminological issues. And there is a distinction that they made between occurrence of signs and signification of signs. So, and they make this point in order to assess whether in the conventional signs or instituted, as you call them, both occurrence and significance are somewhat decided either by convention, institution, or by nature. So certainly those two earlier articles are somewhat relevant to this discussion. But this also leads me to the next point, which is about the somewhat disregarded issue of natural science in Augustine division, right? So as you pointed out, by tracing the linchpins of Augustine theory of science, natural science are simply mentioned as one head of the division of science without much elaboration. So natural science are somewhat alia quaestio. So natural science fell outside the scope of Augustine's inquiry as his interest was in words, as you pointed out. However, the issue of natural signification resurfaces in the Magistro through the discussion of teaching or demonstrating by way of example. Do you think that in this respect, there is perhaps something that could be still of value, or the thesis of the Solus Magister, the divine illumination, somewhat overshadows Augustine's elaboration on this matter? In other words, whilst learning is not necessarily bounded to outward signs, as it is not necessarily sign-mediated, nonetheless, signs are instrumental to teaching, to showing, to demonstrating, and they can help to attending, at least, to the search for truth. So is there anything from the discussion of on the teacher that we could perhaps extrapolate and, let's say, save for our general theory of semiotics that could be of use, or is it altogether somewhat hampered by the conclusion of the Solus Magister, in your view?
I think that certainly there's a great wealth of insights, both with regards to natural signs and to the given signs, the instituted signs. But I think that ultimately, and here I would connect it with that point raised in the De Musica, which one can find in several other passages throughout the De Musica as well, similar points, that even the natural signs are still at this purely instrumental level. And it comes back to that severance of the soul and the body, and the sort of, as it were, absolute superiority of the soul over the body, rather than, say, in contrast to an Aristotelian conception in which anything that's happening to the body is thereby necessarily happening as well to the soul. So the relation, in other words, which is affected, it seems to me, by the sign as something given to sensation or through sensation, doesn't actually reach to the soul. If we can overcome that, if we can get past that, then we can see those contributions that Augustine makes, and I do think save them. But that anthropology, it seems to me, absolutely needs to be revised in order that what's fruitful in the semiotics be elevated and utilized in any further development of our thinking.
Right. This takes me to the last comments, perhaps. Do you think that at this current time, with all the confusion and that is around us, looking inwardly could be something of value or worth pursuing? Or is it something that is completely devoid of value, as it sets on a shaky ground, being based on the divide between the outer world of science and the inner worlds, which, as you pointed out, remain somewhat problematic?
Yeah, well, I think that question can be answered in two ways. I think on the one hand, because there is so much confusion and noise, and the status of the extramentally existent signs is one of chaos, that some retreat from those, some turning away from the ubiquity and the preponderance of rapid fire significations certainly would probably give us all a good bit more calm and measure and focus and clarity. But at the same time, I think we need ultimately to develop an ability better to attend to the signs which are in the world around us, so that we might perhaps filter out better the ones that are worth attending to from the ones that are really just noise. And so I think on the one hand, a turn inward, a turn towards a greater reflexivity, not to the inner person as though that is the locus of truth itself, but a reflexivity upon our own concepts in that first sense, which is mentioned by Ponceau in the text that I read out at the end of the lecture, to really thinking about our concepts as themselves signs and how they are orienting us to the world around us, to orienting ourselves to better interpreting the signs of the world around us, I think is absolutely essential and necessary. And I think that even if we don't follow perhaps the letter of Augustine in his proposal to turn to the inward man, I think something of the spirit is something that we should perhaps aspire to.
Absolutely. I have one last comment, which is also a question. I've noticed that throughout the presentation, there is a reference to something which is called the action of science in our field, right? Or also semiosis or semiosis. So considering that perhaps this video or this presentation will be watched by an audience that is perhaps not accustomed to, let's say, the technical jargon that us scholars use, I was wondering whether you could spend some words in explaining what is semiosis from a non-technical perspective, and how is the action of science, let's say, how the action of science could be unpacked for those that don't have our same background. I think our tasks for the future would also be to somewhat discern between a technical terminology for scholars, but also the possibility to access to such a knowledge to an audience that is, again, a non-technical audience, so a layman. So would you like to comment on that, please?
Yeah, this is a topic of recurrent interest for me over the past several months. In fact, I was invited to give a presentation at St. Vincent's College in Latrobe, one of our partners here in organizing this conference, and where Deely spent his final years of life, oriented towards just that sort of topic. You know, how can we introduce semiotics to the non-technical expert audience? And so I don't think there's any short or perhaps necessarily easy way to do this. The talk I gave ended up being, ended up cutting out a lot of it, and it was still probably too long to hold everyone's attention. But I think if we're to think about the action of signs and to try and present it in as accessible a manner as possible, there are two things that we want to do. The first is to draw upon the obvious examples. There are those examples of things that we call signs: the stop sign, the exit sign, the open sign, sign language, all of these sorts of things which are familiar to us as exhibiting something of that word. But then there's the sign of our own thinking. And I think that's where we really need to perhaps expand upon and draw out the full implication of this notion that signs have a distinctive kind of action to them, that there's a way in which signs operate, which is different from the way that things operate. A thing has its action in itself. It is what it is, and it does what it does from within itself, and in regards to other things in the world, it acts upon them, it is acted upon by them. Whereas a sign, the action of a sign, consists precisely in its relating of things. It's not itself a thing which acts, but it is the action of the relation. And so that's obviously a very, sort of abstract and technical point. It's something that I think we could go back to, say, for instance, my example of the door as a sign of privacy. The privacy isn't in the door itself, but we're all familiar with this, right? This is something which surrounds us, something like privacy or anything else that we can refer to in a semiotic sense. It's something which requires a multiplicity. It requires a multiplicity of things in relation. Privacy can't be of one person alone, right? There has to be something in relation to someone else. And so to think about a thing as a sign of privacy is to think about the multiple complex web of relations in which we always actually live, in which we have actual experience. In a way, I'm kind of dodging your question here because I think explaining semiotics in an accessible manner is in a sense, the most difficult task of the semiotician. So
a challenge for the future.
A challenge for the future. Yeah, I do intend actually to make that presentation public that I gave at St. Vincent's sometime in the near future. So,
excellent.
Maybe that will spark someone else who can give a better, shorter, more succinct explanation of the action of signs.
Right.
But thank you.
Thank you. I also understand that there will be some sequel to this lectures in which you will take up one so as a sort of link to the end of this presentation. So I look forward to listen to that. And thank you once again for bringing forth such an outstanding and brilliant talk to us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your comments. Very helpful, very illuminating, and have given me much more to chew on as we go forward.
Thank you, Dr. Brian. Thank you, Dr. Remo. This is a very engaging dialogue here for us today in this particular session on Augustine instituting the given sign. So gentle reminder to the audience that although we are closing the broadcasting live in Zoom, we are actually continuing here the session for Q&A. So everybody is welcome to participate with comments and questions regarding these two presentations by Dr. Brian and Dr. Remo. Both the speakers are also invited to stay back so that you can engage further with the audience. And at the same time, another gentle reminder that there is another presentation coming up tomorrow, 16 January, and that is on the topic Duns Scotus on Science, Common Nature, High Satiety and Signification by Dr. Paniel Reyes Cardenas. That will be 11 a.m. CST and 5 p.m. UTC. So with this, we close the session for today. Thank you very much, everyone, for participation and for your attention.